Red Planet by Elias Lamshol. This is the mission log of Captain Andreas Becker, mission leader of the New Horizon mission. New Horizon was our first official attempt at putting a man on Mars. This mission had been in the making for about 10 years, though one could argue that mankind had been dreaming of setting foot on Mars since before the days of the airplane. As mission leader and the most senior ranking officer aboard our ship, the honor fell to me to take the first steps on the Red Planet. I don't think I need to tell anyone how terrifying and exciting the proposition of being the first person to walk on Mars was. I could barely contain my trembling as I lowered myself down into the two-man shuttle that would carry myself and Engineer Donahue down to the planet. If I'd known what was waiting for us down there, I would have been trembling for a different reason. Once inside the shuttle, Donahue took the controls while I sat in the co-pilot seat. We ran through our pre-flight checklist, and then we detached the shuttle from the ship. It descended through the atmosphere under the watchful eyes of both the ship's crew and mission control back on Earth. Our trip down was bumpy, but otherwise uneventful. At approximately 2:00 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, we landed on the lip of a 6-mile-wide crater named Attenborough. At the center of this crater was a complex made of modular buildings constructed by a small fleet of unmanned drones. These drones had been working around the clock for months before we had even departed Earth and had been maintaining the complex for our arrival ever since. Our first order of business after completing our planetary walk was to assess the complex and ensure that it was livable for the crew. That's where Engineer Donahue's experience would come in handy. After touching down and ensuring that we were safe to do so, Mission Control gave me the approval to take my first steps. I won't bother to recount the speech that I gave, as the whole thing was recorded via the camera mounted to my helmet, but the experience was one that it would be impossible to replicate. After completing the first successful walk outside of the shuttle, I then returned to the shuttle, and we unloaded the rover which was kept in the cargo bay. The rover was a 6-wheeled vehicle, which could carry all 12 members of the crew and up to 1 ton of cargo. Despite this, it was extremely maneuverable and even armored. Were it not for this armor plating, I imagine the mission might have gone a little differently. Thus, I think it is in order to thank whatever engineer decided we needed that plating. After about an hour on the lip of the crater, we finally began to descend down the crater wall using the rover. The wall of the crater was steep and quite rocky, but the rover performed its duty amicably and maintained traction and stability far beyond what I had expected of it. Once we had descended down the steep wall, we began to cross the flattened bottom of the crater. One might describe the terrain of the crater as unremarkable, as there were no trees, no water, nothing that one might expect to see in a similar formation on Earth. All that we saw were piles of rocks of varying sizes, shapes, and makeup. Were it not that we were on an alien planet, I would have found the crater to be somewhat boring. It reminded me of similar terrain in places like Utah or Nevada, though the soil was arguably much more red. Coming into view was the complex built by the drones. From where we were, it appeared the complex was in good shape and there were no issues. We'd still have to reach the complex and thoroughly assess it before I would give it my stamp of approval. Engineer Donahue and I were still about 2 miles out when something in the distance caught my eye. It looked as though a large boulder was shaking or rumbling. Said boulder then began to lift into the air, and the image resolved itself into a sphere of sorts. This sphere then began to sprout appendages, which could only be described as tentacles. I thought maybe this was some sort of optical illusion, or that the stress of the mission and my excitement were causing me to hallucinate. I pointed the sphere out to Donahue, who confirmed that he was seeing the same thing. I tried to find an explanation for what we were seeing. I was convinced that it must be some sort of optical illusion, until Donahue pointed out that several more spheres were rising up to our right. It quickly became apparent that we were seeing a previously unknown life form. The spheres began to converge on us, and as they did so, I was able to see that their exteriors were made up of a strange red fleshy material. This discovery was quite unsettling to say the least. Donahue made the suggestion that we turn around and go back to the shuttle. I pointed out that that wasn't going to be possible, since the spheres had completely blocked our retreat. The only option that I could see was to reach the complex and take shelter there. Whether the spheres were hostile or not, I didn't know, and I didn't want to be trapped within the rover when we found out. We reached the complex approximately 6 minutes after first contact with the spheres. We then immediately disembarked from the rover and entered the complex, though we continued to wear our spacesuits in case the walls of the complex were somehow breached. The spheres surrounded the complex and seemed to float about aimlessly. They made no attempt to breach the walls or airlocks, though I had a feeling they would have if they knew how. Because there had been no threat of hostile life forms on the planet, we had not been issued any sort of conventional weapons. We were therefore defenseless if the spheres did somehow find a way inside. Donahue, being an engineer, immediately went to work rectifying this situation. Using the battery packs and the electric welding arms from a pair of drones, he was able to produce 2 prods which could deliver an electric jolt should the spheres get too close. I was astounded by his technological prowess, but hoped that we wouldn't have to use them. The spheres continued to hover around for about 3 hours. As stated before, they made no attempt to breach the walls of the complex. However, they seemed keenly interested in the rover. There were at least 3 or 4 spheres surrounding the rover at all times, and occasionally they would strike at it with their tentacles. Thankfully, the armor plating took the brunt of this assault, and they did not damage it too much. It is of note that these attacks did leave welts or dents in the armor plating, which shows that the tentacles themselves would be more than enough to breach either the spacesuits that we wore or the walls of the complex should they have tried. I therefore don't know whether to chalk it up to pure luck or mercy on the part of the spheres that our mission didn't end in complete disaster. After the aforementioned 3 hours, the spheres either became bored or no longer saw us as a threat, and began to disperse. After about 20 minutes, there were no more spheres visible around the complex. It was then that Donahue and I decided to take our chances and get to the rover. If we could get back to our shuttle, we could escape. Mission Control agreed that this was the best course of action. As a senior ranking officer, I felt it was my duty to assume the risk of exiting the facility first. Armed with Engineer Donahue's makeshift weapon, I stepped out of the airlock. I didn't see any spheres, but I trembled at the thought of one of them floating up from behind the rover or from the complex and whipping me with their tentacles. All it would take would be one flick from one of those tentacles, and my suit would crack open like an egg. If I was lucky, I'd die instantly. Thankfully, I didn't see any. The rover had a push-start mechanism since we weren't worried about anyone stealing it on Mars. I started the rover, which was powered by a lithium battery, and was thus fairly quiet, but apparently it wasn't quiet enough. The spheres must have heard the engine, and I saw them floating towards me. I drove toward the airlock where Donahue was waiting, and he climbed in. I floored it and put a considerable distance between us and the complex. The rover had a top speed of 40 miles per hour, which was more than enough for our mission. It should have been enough to put the spheres behind us, but they were slowly gaining on us. I told Donahue to turn on his prod and have it ready just in case. We reached the wall of the crater with about a half-mile of separation between us and the spheres, but that was quickly diminishing as our top speed went down significantly as we began to ascend the steep wall. We were not going to reach the lip of the crater and the shuttle before the spheres were on us, but we had no other choice. There was no turning back. We were about a quarter of the way up the wall when the first sphere reached the bottom of the wall. It could have easily floated up and caught us, but it just stayed there. It was like it was watching us. The rest of the spheres caught up not long after, but they all remained at the bottom of the wall. They didn't bother trying to come up after us. When we reached the lip of the crater and came to a stop, I looked back down and saw nearly a dozen of them at the bottom of the wall. They were waving their tentacles about, but did not seem inclined to come up after us. It is therefore my conclusion that they had simply chased us out of their territory, and once we were no longer a threat, they gave up that chase. It is therefore my belief that they were not acting on malicious intent, but rather an instinctual one. They had simply watched a threat enter their territory and had chased it out like any other animal might have. Why they had not done this with the drones, I don't know. Maybe it was because they couldn't tell they weren't alive. I can't begin to speculate on that. In the end, it didn't matter, and I didn't want to give them time to change their mind, so Donahue and I quickly boarded the shuttle and returned to our ship. It is my recommendation that this mission be counted as a loss, and that we return to Earth. My team is not equipped to deal with the spheres, and any further action may result in devastating consequences. I await further instructions. End of mission log.